Okay, I think we're ready to start. So we can all find your seats, please. So dear colleagues, welcome to this side event on the Plastics Treaty and the BRS CoPs, where we will discuss how to eliminate and restrict plastic chemicals of concern based on a brand new report on the global governance of plastics and associated chemicals. Today's event is organized by the governments of Uruguay, the government of Norway, and the government of Rwanda, and they're members of the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution. We are here at the BRS CoPs in a room at the Geneva International Conference Center. This event is also being streamed online through Zoom. There's some cameras there at the back of the room. So welcome to everyone here in the room, and welcome also to everyone who's joining us through cyberspace. My name is Magnus Løvold. I'm associated with the Norwegian Academy of International Law, and I will, to the best of my abilities, moderate today's event. And I hope you can all hear me well, both here and online. We have a really distinguished panel of speakers with us today, which all know considerably more about chemicals and plastic chemicals than me. Our speakers include Karen Robenheimer. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong, and Karen will present the report that I just mentioned together with Nico Uro, who's a senior research fellow at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. We also have with us Linroy Christian, Director of Analytical Services of Antigua and Barbuda. We have Teresa Karlsson, Science and Technical Advisor at IPEN, and she will join us in a second. Kai Ono-Woodall stepping in for Rolf Paye from the Secretariat for the BRS Conventions, and also Tim Gabriel, Senior Lawyer and Policy Advisor at the Environmental Investigation Agency. Really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Ambassador Mersinger of Uruguay and Ambassador Mørk Smith of Norway have kindly agreed to introduce today's event. We are also lucky to have First Councillor Edmund Tuman Nambazi of Rwanda with us here at the podium, and he will summarize and wrap up our discussions towards the end of our event. Without further ado, I'm pleased now to give the floor first to Ambassador Mersinger for his opening remarks. Ambassador, thank you for being with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Løvold. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the government of Uruguay, Norway, and Rwanda, as members of the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution, I welcome you to the site event titled Plastic Treaty and the BRC CoPs. The purpose of this event is to launch the report Global Governance of Plastics and Associated Chemicals, and to discuss how to eliminate and restrict plastic chemicals of concern with exports. This report is another proof of the compromise of the government of Norway with this important subject in international arena. The world is facing a plastic crisis. Over 100 million tons of plastic waste have accumulated in rivers, lakes, and the ocean over the last 70 years. This, as we are now, and that's why we need an international treaty that we should avoid significant adverse effects on human health by A, phase out the most problematic types of polymers which are the building blocks of plastic. B, phase out the most problematic chemicals used and additives in the plastic materials such as softeners or colorant. C, phase out the most problematic plastic products. In addition, we need to minimize the overall demand of plastic and maximize the circularity and sustainability of remaining plastic on the global market, and achieve environmentally sound management of plastic waste that cannot be reused or recycled while closing point of leakage and addressing sources of pollution. There are 3,200 chemicals of potential concern, but only 128 are currently regulated globally, which means around 400%. Most of the problematic plastic polymers and additives are not covered by the scope of the existing global instruments like the Stockholm and Minamata conventions. This illustrated that a mechanism to regulate chemicals in the new instrument will be an important tool to protect human health and the environment against adverse toxic effects from plastics. The report launched today is an important contribution to a science-based plastic treaty process. It is also a reminder that we, in parallel, are negotiating to establish an intergovernmental science policy panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution prevention. The plastic treaty and the science policy panel will contribute to the work to reduce the risk from chemicals used in plastic and plastic polymers. It is also relevant for us here today that the new plastic treaty and the science policy panel are expected to work closely with other relevant instruments such as the BRS Convention. With that in hand, I pass the word to my colleague, dear colleague, Tyne Mark Smith, permanent representative of Norway in Geneva. Tina.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I'm proud to say that Norway have supported the BRS Secretariat in developing and launching this report on global governance of plastic and associated chemicals. The main objective of the study is to map global governance of plastics and associated chemicals, identify governance gaps, and identify complementarities with existing multilateral instruments, in particular, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, in the context of ongoing intergovernmental efforts to end plastic pollution. In addition, the study discusses the role of international sustainability criteria for plastic and associated chemicals. On behalf of the High Ambition Coalition, co-chaired by the Minister of Climate and Environment of Norway and Rwanda, it is also my pleasure to welcome all speakers and attendants to this event. The High Ambition Coalition is a group of now more than 50 member states with a common ambition to end plastic pollution by 2040. We organized a briefing with Rwanda here at CICG in November last year, when the coalition consisted of 30 members. I am pleased to see how many more have joined the coalition since then, and hope that in the coming months, even more will join this call for an ambitious global agreement to address plastic pollution. As we are here to discuss plastic and associated chemicals, allow me to also underline the scientific evidence of diverse health impacts related to plastics throughout the life cycle, especially women, infants, and young children. This also impacts workers and residents of frontline communities exposed to toxic chemicals used in or generated as a byproduct from the manufacturing of plastics. And it impacts those people exposed to toxic chemicals further down the life cycle of plastics, through use of plastic products and in the management of plastic waste, including waste pickers and waste recyclers. Let us also recognize the growing evidence that humans, animals, and plants are exposed to microplastics. This can contain, carry, and release chemicals of concern, including through consumption of certain foods, such as seafood, fruits, vegetables, inhalation of airborne particles, and ingestion of microplastics in drinking water. The continuous release and accumulation of microplastics to air, water, and land during the production, transport, and use of plastic products and products containing plastics, and the littering and degradation of plastic waste is also of deep concern. These microplastics may pose risk to human health and further contribute to the degradation of ecosystems and biodiversity. With that, I thank you and look forward to hear more from our distinguished experts. Magnus, back to you.
Thank you so very much, both to you, Ambassador Mersinger, and you, Ambassador Mörk-Smith, for those opening remarks. I think that sets the stage really nicely for a good discussion that we're going to have here over the next hour or so. We're going to do a quick scene change. I just want to thank you and you for your remarks and for your country's leadership on this issue. And then we will move on to the next survey. I can also ask Kay, I don't know exactly where you are, to also join us here on the podium. So let's move on to the next item or on our agenda. That it's a real feature of today's event, namely the launch of the new report. And Karen, you have skipped the development of a brand new report, which is hot off the press. It's not been physically printed yet, but it's been launched virtually on the global governance of plastics and associated chemicals. And this report has already been read and described, I've seen, as the most gravitational document for the next session on the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee towards a legally binding instrument of plastic pollution, the process just mentioned by our two ambassadors. And the next session will start, of course, as you all know, in Paris later this month. We are really looking forward to hearing more about this report and to your presentation. Karen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Magnus, for that wonderful introduction, and good day to everyone here and online. Firstly, a thank you from Nico and myself to the Government of Norway and the BRS Secretariat for their assistance with this report, but also the many people who work behind the scenes on this. There's a lot there, a lot of people helped us, and hopefully we've captured you all in the acknowledgements of the report. So it is a long report, it's a complex topic. I'll try and get through it in 15 minutes. It's about 100 pages before we get to references and appendices, and there's important appendices too. So what I'll do today is firstly give you an overview of the study, because we have designed it to be a reference tool. So we'll try and lead you through where you can find different information when you're having different discussions on the plastics agreement and other global governance. I'll then move on to the findings of the mapping. And here I'm going to divide it into two. Firstly, the life cycle phases, what we found that addresses certain life cycle phases, but also the governance elements. So we selected some key governance elements, which we will discuss, and we assessed all the instruments against those. And then finally, the mechanisms for closing the gaps. And here we'll talk about the sustainability criteria for design of products. And within that, the criteria for prioritization of chemicals of concern. So we will be focusing today on the chemical component. There's more discussion on this at the IPEN side event on Thursday evening. We'll go into more detail on the chemicals, but we won't be addressing the design of products themselves. So overview of the study, we had 7 life cycle phases, which we grouped into 4 primary life cycle phases. And the intent here was really to try and highlight where the new agreement should focus, or where we could link in with existing agreements as well. So we had the extraction phase, the sourcing and extraction phase. We had the chemical phase, which looks at the production of chemicals and polymers. And then the material phase, which looks at the manufacture and consumption of materials and products. And finally, the dematerialization phase, which includes collection, sorting, recovery, final disposal, and importantly, remediation. So we looked at binding instruments that directly address aspects of the chemicals in plastics. Here we looked at the Stockholm, Rotterdam Convention, the Montreal Protocol, and the ILO C-170. Binding agreements that directly address aspects of the plastics life cycle. We looked at the Basel Convention, MARPOL Annex 5, London Convention and London Protocol. And then the binding framework agreements of relevance was the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Law of the Sea Convention. We also looked at non-binding frameworks here, the UNEA Resolution, Sustainable Development Goals, and SACOM, of course. And we looked at some other MEAs to see if there were any illustrations that we could use as examples for best practice. And here we looked at the Kiev Protocol, the Aarhus Convention, and the Escazú Agreement. So as mentioned, we first mapped out the governance of chemicals related to plastics, but also the governance of plastics themselves. And on the right, we've got the governance elements that we use to assess those agreements. So firstly, targets and indicators, control measures, so any restrictions on activities, materials, chemicals, products, emissions and releases, but also trade. And then follow up, which would be the reporting, monitoring and inventories, national action plans, and then transparency and information exchange. Once we've done the mapping, we look for areas of convergence and gaps, areas to strengthen existing MEAs, but also to consider under the new plastics instrument, and then the role of sustainability criteria for product design. And a key thing we wanted to really address in this report was the scope of plastic pollution as called for in the resolution, which has not yet been defined. So looking at the content of the report, the first is just an introduction, linking chemicals and plastics and human rights, and the need to define plastic pollution and just some challenges across the life cycle of plastics. The second section is where we really get into the mapping, and here we looked at complementarities and gaps within the binding global instruments, and only where they were relevant to plastics. So we looked at multilateral instruments addressing chemicals and those governing wastes. So for each section, we started with a table that summarizes what is included in that instrument, followed by a discussion on what is addressed, and then a discussion on what is not addressed, trying to stick to the mandate of that instrument. If you look at Appendix 1, we've compiled all of those tables, summary tables, into Appendix 1 so that you've got a quick reference in that appendix. Appendix 2 also has a more detailed mapping than Section 2. And here we've grouped it according to the life cycle phases. So if you are having a discussion about a particular phase, you can go to that appendix and see exactly what each agreement is saying about that. And then Appendix 3 is a summary of the non-binding measures. But importantly, at the end of this chapter, we also included a section on opportunities to address the plastics life cycle that might fall outside the scope of the instruments we looked at. Section 3 is really a reference section. So we looked at some of the globally agreed principles and approaches and divided that into some of the elements used in the UNEA resolution. So it's a sort of a grouping of some of the language that's already been agreed. And Section 4 then moves ahead again and looks for a way forward and looking at potential mechanisms for closing these governance gaps across the full life cycle of plastics and associated chemicals. And here we talked about the development of international sustainability criteria for plastics and associated chemicals, ways to identify and address chemicals and polymers of concern, and then just other possible mechanisms for closing the governance gaps. So just to finish on the report, the appendices in Appendix 4, we've got a list of all the chemicals of relevance that have been listed under existing agreements. Also a compilation of any existing selection criteria as a quick reference, and then the OECD chemicals perspective for sustainable plastics design, which could also help as a starting point for sustainability criteria. So the findings of the mapping. Firstly, the scope of plastic pollution, we know it needs to include chemicals of concern, and we've listed their processing aids, additives, monomers, and non-intentionally added substances. Polymers of concern, so we have thermoplastics and thermoset, for example, and problematic plastics such as multiple materials and single-use plastics, but also microplastics where they are intentionally added or non-intentionally produced. So looking at the mapping across the life cycle, the first phase is extraction and sourcing, and here we have minimal regulation. The Minamata Convention is one of the only that identifies a full life cycle from resource extraction, but it's only relevant to very specific uses in plastics, such as the production of vinyl chloride monomers and production of polyurethane using mercury-containing catalysts. We also looked at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which does not directly address plastics, but it is useful and relevant to plastics governance because of the petrochemical feedstocks that we know 10.5% of global oil demand goes into producing plastics. And by addressing the plastics issue, we can play a big role in preventing and reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well. The second phase is the chemical phase, and here we have limited regulation. Only a fraction of chemicals associated with the plastics life cycle are regulated under existing MEAs. The Stockholm Convention, Minamata Convention, the Montreal provide some provisions that regulate these chemicals. The Rotterdam Convention provides some on information exchange, and then SACOM has some voluntary activities related to hazard and risk assessment. So just looking at the number of chemicals that we have, the big circle on the left, you can see the number of chemicals we know that are included in plastics. The large gray section is those that have no hazard data at all. And the tiny thin sliver in black are the chemicals that are regulated. And if we expand it onto the circle on the right in yellow, most of them are under the Stockholm Convention. There's 100 chemicals there at the moment. The Montreal Protocol has 10 and the Minamata has 18, and that represents only 1% of the chemicals we know are used in plastics. So how did we get to this point, and how are we going to fix this is the big question. So MEAs that do control or restrict production and use of plastics-related chemicals, we know the Stockholm prohibits and restricts use of POPs and releases of unintentional POPs, and there's some uses there such as open burning and waste incinerators. The Montreal Protocol prohibits the use of ODS and HFCs, and examples are production of extruded polystyrene and polyurethane foams, but there are exemptions for use as processing agents and feedstocks in plastics. The Minamata Convention restricts the use of mercury and mercury compounds in the production of polyurethane, particulate catalysts, and in vinyl chloride. Moving to the material phase, the third phase, this is where we've identified the greatest gap. There are no global measures in place to reduce plastic production and use. And this leads to, if we can address this, it will help us to reduce our chemical and resource use, which will also then help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So what we need here is sustainable design of products. There's some indirect measures in the Basel Convention regarding waste minimization and prevention. And SACOM has some voluntary activities related to sustainable design of e-products. So there's not much that we have to go on at the moment. Dematerialization phase is probably the most comprehensively addressed, as we'd expect. Basel Convention has the plastic waste amendments that deal with the transboundary movement of plastics. MARPOL Annex 5 and the London Protocol ban the discharge or dumping of all plastics into any jurisdictional zones of the oceans. The Minamata and Stockholm Conventions have measures on remediation of sites contaminated with regulated chemicals, and some of these are used in plastics. And then the Convention of Biological Diversity addresses rehabilitation and restoration of degraded systems, but where plastic waste is mentioned, this is really only in soft law. So looking at the governance elements, for targets and indicators, the Montreal Protocol and the Minamata Convention have some mitigation targets with time schedules, but those are only relevant to a very small amount of chemicals related to plastics. For the control measures, there, as we know, are some MEAs that phase out chemicals and materials. There's some that regulate chemicals, materials, and products, and there's some that minimize releases and emissions. But we found some significant governance gaps in that the chemicals of concern is very limited. Polymers of concern, there's none. Microplastics and nanoplastics, there's none. And then unnecessary, avoidable, and problematic plastics, there's none. Trade of plastics, when it comes to products and constituent materials, these are mostly unregulated except for some chemicals. Plastic waste, as we know, the transboundary movement of that is regulated under the Basel Convention. So we felt here that we need to build on some of the initiatives that are underway under the World Trade Organization and the Forum on Trade, Environment and SDGs, as well as some lessons to be learned from e-waste. Reporting is fragmented at all levels. The Stockholm Convention, every 4 years, parties must report on production, export, and import, for example. Minamata Convention every 4 years with interim reports every 2 years on the use of mercury in facilities that produce some very small component of plastics. Basel Convention annually, member states must report on all imports and exports of plastic waste, but it's voluntary to report on the generation of plastic waste. Inventories, the Minamata Convention mandates the emissions and releases for relevant sources of mercury to be in inventories. The Stockholm Convention is voluntary to maintain inventories of POPs that may be present in plastics. And here we found the Kiev Protocol on pollutant releases and transfer registers may help for some aspects of inventories, where it's required to report on pollutant releases and transfers by operators and owners, as well as on recovery and final disposal operations. National action plans, again, this is limited. There's some components are addressed in the Stockholm Convention for national implementation plans. Here we can build on the Paris Agreement to periodically update national contributions, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity, where action plans should facilitate effective links to other MEAs, involve relevant sectors, and influence national planning processes. But I think the key thing here is to realize that the national action plans as a mechanism is not a key building block for cohesive global action in closing all these governance gaps that we've identified. And then finally, transparency and information sharing. This is also limited. The Stockholm Convention has some mandatory labeling for some POPs, but there are some exemptions for uses in plastics. The Rotterdam Convention has information on the trade of particular chemicals. Some of these have uses in plastics. And for the Basel Convention, transboundary movement of plastic waste must be accompanied by a movement document, and this must specify the hazardous characteristic of the waste or that its management requires some special consideration. And then SACEM has some voluntary general requirements to provide information on chemicals throughout their life cycle, including chemicals in products. So the last section of the presentation is closing mechanisms to close the gaps. And here we've recommended developing the sustainability criteria for the design of plastic and focusing on performance outcomes. So elimination of chemicals and polymers of concern towards non-toxicity, and promoting longevity, stability, recyclability, and of course, reduction and minimization. This needs to be supported by transparency criteria. And here we can build on the initiatives of the ISO and the OECD. Important under the sustainability criteria is criteria for prioritization and listing. There are some under existing MEAs, so there's different criteria for prioritization and listing of substances of concern based on hazard and or risk. And the Stockholm Convention, Montreal, some in the Basel and the MARPOL Annex 5. But for polymers of concern, we found no criteria for prioritization of listings. So moving forward, how can we build and learn from existing MEAs? We know that the Stockholm Convention uses a negative or black list, which we could employ. The London Protocol uses a positive or white list, which could be an option. Otherwise, we could use a hybrid approach, which uses a black list, a white list, and a grey list. And that grey list will be important for those chemicals that have no hazard data. But importantly here, we need a mechanism for moving chemicals from one list to another. And we'd also need to consider how we're going to work with developments under other MEAs. So that's an important component when we create our listings. So how can we also move forward here with the sustainability criteria? Well, we're suggesting that the INC develop some high-level sustainability criteria that could be included in the text of the agreement. We could then develop some detailed criteria on non-toxicity, etc. And these could be included in possible annexes to the instrument, and there'll be more than one annex likely. These could function as a living document, and they could be developed and maintained through a subsidiary body, particularly a scientific mechanism. So with that, I will finish. I'll close. This is the cover page of the report. It can be found at the link here. And I've also included Nico's email and my email should anyone want to discuss anything or if you need any assistance in the future, we're happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Karen. And yes, indeed, I think a round of applause is well deserved. This has been it's a huge work, it's a huge undertaking. So congrats really on this report. I think it's also very impressive how you now managed to present something so complex, not just the complexities of chemicals and plastics, but also the complexities of international global governance and present it so clearly. So thank you so much for that. I'm sure that many here in the audience that you have questions to the report and to Karen, and you will have the chance to ask those questions in a minute. But first, I'd like to introduce and turn to our panelists who've joined us today, and I'll start with you, Teresa. From a scientist's perspective, when we talk about chemicals and plastics, which chemicals are really of main concern? What are we talking about here? How can they best be grouped and addressed in this new plastics treaty, which is currently under negotiations? And what do you see as the potential synergies with the BRS conventions in these respects?
Thank you very much, Magnus, and thank you to the previous speakers and also to Karen and Nico for your excellent work. I think that this report will be crucial for the upcoming negotiations for the INC. IPAN has worked with the BRS conventions for 25 years. In fact, it was founded around the INC negotiations of the Stockholm Convention. And we believe that there are several elements in the BRS conventions that will be useful to take inspiration from when setting up criteria for how to regulate chemicals under the Plastics Treaty. This governance report clearly shows that plastics are chemicals. They're made with and from chemical monomers and polymers and chemical additives. And as we've heard today, for most of those chemicals, we don't know what the toxic effects are. And for the ones that we have data on, we can see that there are thousands of chemicals that are endocrine disruptants, carcinogenics, and toxic. So there are important gaps that the Plastics Treaty can and should address. For example, the Stockholm Convention cannot address chemicals that are toxic but not persistent, since persistence is a criterion for listing under the convention. To address these gaps, a future plastics treaty would therefore need to use criteria that go beyond the criteria of the Stockholm Convention. One important lesson learned from the Stockholm Convention is the importance of working with groups of chemicals. And groups of chemicals are also highlighted in the report. Right now, 6 chemicals, or actually 5, since methoxychlor was listed yesterday, are under evaluation of the Stockholm Convention. Of these, at least 3 have been used as regrettable substitutes for chemicals that have previously been banned under the convention. And this shows the importance of addressing chemical groups. But the Stockholm Convention is also an inspirational example here, because there are groups of chemicals that are addressed under the Stockholm Convention, showing that it is possible. And there are already several groups of chemicals that are used in plastics where the science is clear. It clearly shows us that there are harmful effects for human health and the environment, and that they are of global concern. One example is chlorinated paraffins. We have short-chain chlorinated paraffins listed under the Stockholm Convention, but science has shown that regardless of the chain length, they have toxic effects. So the Plastics Treaty could therefore address them as a wider group when used in plastics. Similarly, several subgroups of PFAS are listed under the Stockholm Convention, but big parts of the PFAS family is still not regulated internationally, and the Plastics Treaty could address the full group of PFAS used in plastics. There are also several monomers and polymers that are used to make plastics that are known to cause harm to human health and the environment, such as bisphenols, which are a large group of chemicals known to be endocrine disruptants. Lastly, I would like to highlight that the Stockholm Convention in its preamble recognizes the health concerns, especially in developing countries, in particular impacts upon women and through them upon future generations, as well as the particular risk for indigenous communities. These same health concerns are seen for toxic chemicals in plastics. To protect human health and the environment from the harmful effects of plastics across its life cycle, it is therefore crucial that the protection of human health and the environment are reflected throughout the control measures of the treaty. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Teresa. And I think indeed that the last point you're making about the need for human health to be reflected also in the negotiations of a plastic pollution treaty is something that I think we've seen over especially the last year or the last years, and more clearly that that's a growing concern in those negotiations, which is very interesting to see. Thank you for those remarks. I'd like now to turn to you, Tim. As maybe many of you here in the room know or are aware, a couple of weeks ago, the Secretariat to the Plastic Treaty negotiations, they released a paper on the potential options for elements in the new treaty. And we find amongst the elements suggested there, and this paper is of course based on the submissions made by states after the first round of negotiations in Uruguay. And we find among the suggestions here a proposal to ban, phase out, reduce or control specific polymers and chemicals of concerns or group of chemicals. And I'd like to ask you, Tim, how, in your view, should the plastic treaty regulate chemical additives or chemicals of concerns, and like through which core obligations or control measures should this regulation take place in your view?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Yes, the option papers brought together the suggested control measures and core obligations on how to deal with plastics at large. But when looking at it from a chemical perspective, we can see three main type of core obligations and control measures relevant to chemicals. In my opinion, we're going to need to advance all of them in some way within the context of the Plastics Treaty if we're meaningfully going to be able to get at the issue of chemicals and plastics. So the measures are, first, there's this notion that we should be exploring how to eliminate polymers and chemicals of concern, which was previously identified. The notion there is to have an annex that would list certain chemicals and polymers of concern for phase out. Now, they would be guided by some criteria which have yet to be developed. Some have suggested that the criteria itself should also be included in the annex. That's not necessarily required. It could also be adopted by the Conference of the Parties at a later date, but that some sort of criteria would guide the listing of these chemicals of concern in an annex. To my mind, I see this quite simply, actually. If they're toxic and there's substitutes available or they're unnecessary, they should be listed. We don't need them in the environment. With that being said, criteria would guide the listing in an annex, and there may be the need for some exemptions, certain critical uses or essential uses that could be identified as well, or in certain applications that might need some more time. So that's the first measure, is to eliminate the chemicals of concern. So we would reduce the complexity of the problem. It's important to underscore, though, that here we must avoid a whack-a-mole approach. As we've seen, listing certain chemicals sometimes leads to substitutions of chemicals that are in the same family. So the chemical cousins, one example would be BPA, where upon banning BPA, we've seen people shift to BPF and BPS, which are just as problematic, if not more so. And so in trying to avoid a chemical by chemical approach or whack-a-mole approach, we should be looking at families or groups of chemicals for listing wherever possible. So that's the first measure, is to eliminate the chemicals of concern. The next measure that we've sort of identified that relates to chemicals and fostering circularity is the design principles that were mentioned. So here the notion is that we would adopt some sustainability criteria or some sort of eco criteria that would be then developed and adopted and applied to plastic products. These could be general criteria that apply to all plastic products and restrict the chemicals or require certain conditions to be met. Or these could be product-specific criteria, such as those for food contact materials or bottles. Regardless, the notion is that the treaty, the Conference of the Parties, would adopt this criteria, and that governments would have the obligation to then adopt and implement them in their national legislation or through other means. It's important to note that these criteria would be developed through an iterative process. I don't know if we can get the product design criteria inside of the convention itself as an initial matter, but what we need are the tools to be able to adopt criteria at a later date. We can convene task forces, we can look at certain product categories, and we can restrict them to certain polymers and chemicals so that we have confidence upon collecting them, that we can put them back into the market in the same or similar use and create that circularity that otherwise we don't have right now. When it comes to the design for circularity, I think here we have the opportunity to take a bit of a different approach than the elimination of chemicals of concern. So on the elimination of chemicals of concern, we'll be listing those that we do not want in our plastic products. We'll essentially be approaching it through a blacklist approach. But here with design criteria, we have the opportunity to advance a whitelist approach, i.e. identify those permissible polymers and identify those permissible chemicals, the ones that we have confidence are not negatively impacting our health. And then by virtue of the listing, all others would no longer be permissible. So it's a real opportunity here to clean up the product chemical stream, as it were, And it would all be designed around this notion of creating circularity so that when we collected a bottle and when we shredded it and when we wanted to put it back into a same or similar use, we had confidence that the polymers and the chemicals restricted to certain ones that won't harm human health. So that's the second measure, is fostering design for circularity. And the other main category would be to ensure transparency. On that, it's been suggested that we should track the types and volumes of chemicals used in the production of plastics across the life cycle. As we just saw before, chemicals make their way into plastics or the materials or the raw materials that become plastics at all stages. And we should be tracking this and have transparency across the supply chain so that we know what are ultimately in plastics that we use. And then the related measure to that is transparency. Somehow we need to find a way to pass on the information on the chemical constituents along the supply chain. There's been suggestions of digital watermarks or tracers, of harmonized product labeling, of material safety data sheets, of product passports and publicly available databases. But at some point we need to figure out the best approach towards passing along the information on the chemical constituents in plastics from the beginning of their life to the end, so that we can indeed create the circular economy and have one that's protective of public health. So those are the three main measures: elimination of chemicals of concern, design criteria for products, and transparency. I'll just say that the numbers on the number of chemicals that we have placed into plastics for which we have no data is a big concern. And I'd like to just share the notion that, we should have a principle. If there's no risk data, there should be no market. We need to put the burden on the producers and the people who are putting the chemicals on the market to provide the information in which we can make informed decision-making. So I'll just end with saying that that's how the countries have suggested we approach the issue of chemicals from our reading of the options paper. And I think if we're going to take a comprehensive approach to plastics and plastic pollution, we should look at each one meaningfully and advance some sort of measures to get at it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Tim. Very clear points, clear recommendations coming there. And I think if you'd like to know more about Tim's and EII's views on this and other aspects related to the plastic pollution treaty and the negotiations, you've made a submission to the INC, I believe, and there's also other products coming out. So that's all hugely appreciated. I would like now to turn to you, Kay. And I think it's clear to everybody, and that's partly why this side event is being organized. It's clear to everybody this plastic pollution treaty negotiations, they don't take place in a vacuum. And the BRS Secretariat, you've made a very useful written submission to that process. And this outlines the objectives and the core obligations and implementation elements of the BRS conventions. And maybe based on this, it would be really useful to hear from UK whether there are any particular experiences or lessons learned from the BRS conventions that the negotiators of the plastic pollution treaty could benefit from in their efforts to develop effective governance of plastic chemicals. And also it would also be useful to have your reflections on how we can ensure complementarity between this new treaty under development and the existing BRS conventions.
Right. Thank you very much. And first of all, really, thank you very much to the government of Norway for supporting this development of the report. And thanks to all authors and contributors that we were able to analyze global governance of chemicals and plastics. Thank you for the question. I think it's not just only the negotiators of plastics, but also negotiators or BRS focal points should be actively involved in this plastics negotiation, as it really relates closely with what your governments or industry NGOs are working towards protecting human health and the environment from chemicals and waste. I mean, somebody mentioned that this needs to be having health impact be considered. It is very natural to me that this issue will need to target human health, as we have all been worked to protect human health and the environment from chemicals and waste. As regards to lessons learned, I have been supporting the process for listing new chemicals under the Stockholm Convention, Rotterdam Convention, and plastic negotiation under the Basel Convention. We have seen very good cooperation, relationship with science and policymakers, industry, and NGO. When we consider new chemicals proposed for listing, each and every sector has certain amount of understanding or non-understanding and expertise. So all this information has been super important. And even during this COP, we have been basing the consideration in the document called Risk Management Evaluation that sort of crystallized the information that was being collected from industry, NGO, and then finalized with the experts' decision-making process. So this is political now discussion happening at the COP, but this is backed up by the scientific committee's consideration, and that this experience could be very beneficial for the plastics negotiation. And very good point raised by Team for Regrettable Substitution, as we have seen, and also the suggestion to list the groups of chemicals. I might sound like industry, but if you want to eliminate substance, but you still need to have certain functionality in the plastics, then the natural thing is to look for some chemical with similar properties. And that is why a similar chemical within the same group of chemical often be used as alternatives. And here, this is perhaps where countries need to consider how to negotiate what can be listed and so on. The biggest fear is that because there's no alternatives, this might not be able to be eliminated at all if you just stick to that. But I fully agree that regrettable substitution has been a big challenge under the Stockholm Convention. You have seen a lot. Then, the Stockholm Convention also has very good texts like precautionary approach, lack of full scientific uncertainty shall not prevent from listing, and so on. So there are several concepts that has been very useful in terms of managing hazardous chemicals. I would like to finally point on the implementability of measures. We have just discussed in this room, contact group on listing, about labeling, possible labeling or identification of chemicals in products, mainly plastics or coatings or cables and so on. And as this new treaty would consider larger scope of chemical that are of concern, POPs are one of the most concerned substances, right? So then the new treaty, if they have put in place any measures related to identification, traceability, and so on, those should be considered for POPs as well. And do we have that provisions already under the Stockholm Convention? Yes, there is. So parties can already implement this identification of POPs in products, but it is very, very difficult. And who is it that really implement? This was also discussion at the contact group previously. Is it the manufacturer who needs to do this? Or is it the party who will impose the manufacturer to do this labeling effort? And what about those products that are already in the world? How do we then identify? I'm now talking about potential recycling and waste stream. And so it is quite complex problem, but I would like to emphasize that the BRS focal points, convention COP participants, you have very good experience already, and really encourage you to actively involve in this negotiation process for plastic pollution. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Kay. That's really useful guidance, I think, for those involved in the plastic pollution treaty negotiations. And you bring up a lot of points that I hope we can discuss more, including the need for a science policy interface that we might be able to get into a little bit later in this event. But I'd like to pick up on something that Tim mentioned in his introduction and bring you, Nico, also into our discussion. And congrats to you as well, very much for the report that Karen just introduced earlier. But transparency is a key issue when it comes to effective international governance of plastics. Just want to hear from you, why is this important, and how can the Plastics Treaty help promote or even ensure transparency?
Thank you, Magnus. Well, I will first answer the question, why do we need transparency? And one of the most common questions came up to us when we circulated the first draft of the BRS report is, how come are there over 3,000 chemicals of concern in plastics? This really came as a surprise to the reviewers, and delegation after delegation asked, how come are we in this situation that we have toxic chemicals in our everyday products in numbers of thousands? There are many reasons to this, and it's important to find the root cause. And of course, this could be a study of its own. But one main reason is the lack of transparency that drives the continued use of chemicals of concern. Agreement on minimum transparency requirements for chemicals in plastics will help to detoxify the markets, because no company wants to openly market the use of toxic chemicals in their products. Lack of transparency also hinders effective control by customs authorities. Many developing countries are net importers of plastics, and transparency requirements will help them to detect and reject hazardous chemicals and materials in imported goods. Lack of information of chemical and polymer content also risks contaminating recycling streams. So transparency requirements are a prerequisite to realize a safe circular economy for plastics, what many countries are now calling for. Then, how can we promote transparency? There are many opportunities. Transparency is fundamentally about the need to strengthen the right to know, and it is possible to build on existing experiences from the Aarhus Convention and the ESCASO agreement. The Aarhus Convention requires parties to ensure that sufficient product information is available to the public in a manner which enables the consumers to make informed choices. As mentioned by Karen, transparency could be realized by agreeing on global criteria for transparency to help harmonize what is expected from producers and manufacturers in disclosing product information. This could possibly be an annex to the agreement. It would be valuable to make use of modern digital tools, such as digital product passports, with information on product components and their supply chain, such as the origin, that is digitally accessible, for example, by using a simple QR code. This is actually already becoming the norm in the EU through its Green Economy Plan. The agreement could also help in harmonizing labeling of products across the value chain. Labeling in light of the sustainability criteria could then allow consumers to make informed choices. Expanding and harmonizing the use of HS codes used in trade also provides a valuable opportunity to increase transparency. Inventories are also an important aspect of transparency, because they could be used to collect and make data available on chemicals, polymers, plastic products, emissions, and releases. Availability of such data can help to create pressure to shift production and consumption patterns. The pollutant and release transfer registers promoted by the Kiev Protocol provides a very useful model to build on, because it requires the operators and the owners of the industrial facilities to report on releases from final disposal and recovery operations. Sharing existing hazard and risk data of chemicals is also very important for transparency, because it creates efficiency in the system and saves a lot of money. More broadly, the development of a global knowledge hub with data on chemicals' identities, their hazard properties, and their occurrence will be critical for improving access to information that is often hard to find and behind paywalls. I would also like to mention that transparency is closely linked to public participation. So consideration could be given to ensuring effective and inclusive public participation to the preparation of national action plans for plastic pollution. And just to conclude, in very simple terms, as also mentioned by Tim, if there is no data on chemicals, it shouldn't have any markets. That's a principle by the EU, and I think that should also apply to the new plastics agreement. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Nico. Finally, last but definitely not least in the panel here, I would like to turn to you, Dr. Linroy Christian. And as a government representative, what do you make of what you've heard so far, both the presentation and the comments made by the other panelists? And it would also be interesting to hear your views, I believe, on what you see as the synergies between the BRS conventions and the Plastic Pollution Treaty when it comes to the governance of chemicals. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the government of Norway and for the other colleagues, scientists and experts who would have contributed to today's discussion. Which is clearly quite relevant in the grand scheme of things as it relates to chemicals and waste in general. From the perspective of countries who are net importers, not necessarily manufacturers of some of these components, it is quite important for us to establish what the health impact is to persons within our region. And there are other conventions, for instance, like the Cartagena Convention, specifically the Land-Based Source of Pollution Protocol, which also, I think, plays a role, not necessarily brought forward in this particular report, but identifies what could happen within our region, within the Caribbean Sea, Caribbean sub-region, that could negatively impact not just human health, environment health, but ultimately the economy within our region. Now, we have within the BRS conventions, well-established mechanisms for assessing chemicals, for proposing how they are restricted. And I think these lessons have to be brought forward within the Plastics Convention. The scientific bodies such as the POPs Review Committee have played a significant role, and it is quite important that these types of mechanisms come forward. Of course, the evaluation of the effectiveness of the convention, again, well practiced within BRS, is another mechanism that has to come through with respect to the Plastics Convention. The issue of compliance, which again, we struggle with within the BRS family, some more so than others. It's also something that is quite important, that should be ironed out within the early parts of the negotiation of the Plastics Treaty. Now, as it relates to how we within our region specifically or similar countries manage how we go about regulating these chemicals, how we treat with the end of life of these chemicals to ensure that, again, at the end of the life, the waste management is also key. And there are lessons under the Basel Convention that can help us with treating with these end-of-life products. And it is something that has already caused issues within many countries. And I hope that we cannot, again, allow this to continue. And the issue of being able to identify these chemicals in products means that we have to enhance capacity. Laboratory capacity, which is dear to my heart in terms of us establishing causality. It means that we must be able to effectively improve our capacity to monitor for these chemicals and to show how they affect human and environmental health. So this capacity also, it's a national obligation, and countries have to step up as it relates to how they improve their institutional capacity, their technical capacity to address, and not necessarily rely on the convention to do this, but the convention should also bring forward these perspectives as to how the countries could enhance their capacity to address these chemicals of concern and how they end up in alternative products and the upcycling and other economic activities that may come from plastics and how they affect human health. So these are just some of the areas that I think could be of importance to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Linroy. Greatly appreciated. And I'm just listening to both the presentation and the remarks here, just struck by all the expertise and so many good recommendations. So it really bodes well, I think, for the second round of negotiations on the Plastic Pollution Treaty, which starts later this month in Paris. I would like now to open for questions from the floor. Those who wish to ask a question to some of the panelists, please just indicate so, I think, by raising your hand. Yes, I see one question over there. Please introduce yourself and let us know who you would like to answer your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am Dr. Abbas from Pakistan. And thank you for the panelist and Dr. Karan for launching this report. As you mentioned in your presentation, that only 128 chemicals, that is 1% of globally, and 24% about chemicals of potential concerns, and 29% chemicals of low concern, and 46% chemicals without hazard data. So if we evaluate these chemicals, and now new treaty and negotiation is going on, then whether the manufacturers and producers of these chemicals are ready to stop the use of these chemicals in plastics, and whether they are able to make the alternates of these chemicals of concern, because the treaty is going to be finalized by 2024. And this is very important, that if these chemicals are being used, and we are talking about to control and plastic pollution, so it is very challenge for all the member countries, that how can we get rid of these chemicals which are being used. As Ms. Key pointed out, that only some POPs which are being used in some like BDs in plastic products, even we could not able to implement and enforce the control of few chemicals in plastic products like e-waste. So how can we able to get rid of the other chemicals which are being used in plastic? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Great question. I think we should see if there are also other questions and then group them like we would group chemicals. Yes, I see a bit back there in blue.
Thank you. Thanks for all the panelists, and thanks for Karen and Nico for the good presentation. I'm Tuuli Atoikka from the Finnish Environment Ministry, and I should be able to take case good advice with me to do the BRS models and utilize them in the plastic negotiations, as I'm doing both negotiations. But I wanted to, there were some examples about how the good scientific information can back up the policy decisions. And I mentioned that, for example, POPs Convention has managed to do that. But I would like to hear a little bit more from Karen, perhaps, about when you are doing the report and studying this issue, how do you see the role of the science policy interface in the future plastic treaty? And especially when we are trying to restrict the chemicals of concern under the new treaty. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that great question as well. I think there was also one here in front. Walter, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Magnus, and thank you to all the panelists for their very informative and comprehensive interventions, and also for the preparation of this great report that will definitely improve the process of the negotiation of INC and the upcoming INC2 meeting. Maybe a question to Teresa or to anyone else who wants to complement that. One would be knowing that the challenge and the figures about the large amount of chemicals that are not yet regulated under the BRS conventions and yet may present some hazards in terms, to health, to the environment, and also that should be addressed under the INC future treaty. What will be the best way to approach that challenge of quantity, knowing that quality is important, but also the amount of quantity, a way that perhaps could be addressed will be based on the experience of BRS, perhaps instead of going on substance by substance or molecule by molecule to establish some clusters of chemicals that could be included in the future potential listing under the plastic treaty, if that is something that you foresee as feasible from the scientific point of view, mostly, and rather than political. And then the other question or connected question will be how to overcome the challenges for all countries, but particularly for developing countries in terms of identification, characterization of chemicals containing or contaminated by hazardous by plastic products containing or contaminated by hazardous chemicals without sufficient means of implementation for that challenge. Thank you again for the great event.
Thanks. Another great question there. I think we have a lot to respond to, and I'd like to turn maybe first to you, Karen, to answer some of these questions. I think some of them were directly addressed to you. Maybe to start with that question about how the role of the science policy interface, and I think it would also be very interesting to hear your view on the question from the gentleman from Pakistan regarding maybe the realism involved in finding alternatives to some of these chemicals, given the short time available for the treaty negotiations. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the question too. So with the scientific mechanism, obviously I've mentioned the development of the sustainability criteria, which would include hazard and risk criteria. So the role of a scientific mechanism there, or SPI, could be to develop and maintain those criteria, also just keeping track of whether they're still relevant and whether there's enough detail to capture everything. A glossary of terms, there's been calls for definitions at this stage, but we also need terms to help interpret the agreement. So we've heard mention of assessment of new chemicals of concern. So perhaps the scientific mechanism can do that before products are placed on the market or added to the white list, blacklist, grey list, whichever mechanism we end up with. I think there's also an important role in developing global indicators. We don't yet know what our indicators will be for this agreement, particularly regarding chemicals. And there's also a need to assess and to track those indicators for progress. There's a lot of science, and I think there's a role there to review and aggregate that science and the science that is important to the agreement. And there is a lot of science that's going on, and it's difficult to keep track of that. So I think the science policy interface would be an important place for that. And that science would obviously cover the environment, human health, and some of the socioeconomic aspects as well. And I think there's also a role there for determining the financial needs of the agreement, particularly for developing countries to comply with the agreement. So there's a lot there. We are going to be producing another report, a much shorter one this time, but we'll be looking at in more detail the role of the SPI, but also how it links to the science policy panel. So I think that's an important component of this too. So who will be responsible or looking at which aspects of the plastic component under both. For the first question from Pakistan, I might hand over to Nico on that one, if you don't mind.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. It's a very important question. We have over 3,000 chemicals of concern, and how to really start restricting them. It's a huge undertaking. And in section 4, we actually provide and outline different approaches how this can be done. And we discuss the pros and cons of each option. So it would include a black list, a gray list, or white list, or any combination of these. So actually, maybe a hybrid combination could work where you would have a black list that would consist of an initial set of priority groups of chemicals to be restricted, focusing on those groups of chemicals where scientific consensus is high of their health concerns. This includes bisphenols, phthalates, flame retardants, and PFAS. And then a mechanism needs to be developed for adding new groups of chemicals of concern over time, but it would be important to start of those groups of chemicals where the scientific consensus of harm is high. And this could be then combined with a chemical simplification approach, which then would imply the use of a white list, as mentioned by previous speakers, of those chemicals that are deemed safe, where we have that hazard and risk assessment data. So we could simply do this white list of those chemicals. And also, there's a lot of chemicals, almost 6,000 chemicals that really lack hazard data. So we don't know if these chemicals are safe or if they are hazardous. So in my view, this could be put into a gray list, because if we don't have information about their hazards, then it's a big question mark if they are safe or not. And also data and information of chemicals and hazard risk needs to be consolidated and made publicly available in this information hub. So this will speed up the detoxification of the plastics value chain. And the hazard criteria should then be incorporated in the overall sustainability criteria, which then would be the umbrella for designing plastics. And this non-toxicity would be one component of this sustainability criteria as proposed. And it's also important to ensure that the plastics instrument is proactive rather than reactive in listing chemicals, so that listing does not happen after the chemicals have been introduced to the markets. And the Stockholm Convention aims to be preventative in this sense, as Article 3 states that parties must prevent the production and use of chemicals that exhibit characteristics of POPs according to the criteria in Annex D. This aspect should be strengthened in the plastics instrument following the principle of no data, no market. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Nico. Karen, yeah, quickly.
So I just want to add to that and respond to the point you made about the time that we have. And I think it's important that we have some intersessional working groups on this. Obviously, that request must come from member states, but I think this is a really important component if we want to address design like the resolution has asked for. If anyone has any other ideas, but I think the sustainability criteria is an important component of that, and it's not been done in other agreements before. So I think this is a topic we need to get onto very quickly and in quite detail to know what text we can put into the agreement that might give us the mandate to continue with this after the agreement's been adopted if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. I believe maybe you would also like to come in on this question, Tim. Over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide some general reflections on what was said. I want to maybe start by stating the obvious, but what this treaty contains is by no means decided. We are confronting a lot of differing views and trying to reach a global agreement that's going to have some notion of compromise involved with it. So while we're here on this panel articulating some great ideas about how we could approach chemicals, these are not shared broadly by many countries in the world. And we are going to have to work very hard to make sure that we have a treaty that's fit for purpose and can address these issues over time. Which leads me to my second point is some of these issues, I do feel the urgency, absolutely the urgency, but I also just want to reflect the fact that, we have given ourselves a short time frame for developing the treaty. Our aspiration is to finish by 2024. And then there could be some potential work that happens intersessionally, of course, and then afterwards as well, while we're waiting for ratification and entry into force, not unlike what happened with Minamata. convention where they had some OEWGs and some meetings after the agreement was put up for signature. But what we're undertaking now is it's going to be a generational effort. We are not going to solve this anytime soon. We are extremely underwater. We have over 3,000 chemicals of concern. We have very little data. We need to start swimming up to the surface very quickly. So while we can and should do some intercessional work though, but we also need to recognize that we're not going to be able to get it all done. And so we need to create the enabling provisions in the treaty itself to be able to take decisions as more information becomes available, as we deliberate on certain chemicals, so that we can then act on that information and adopt decisions to list chemicals of concern in an annex or to develop criteria. And so the enabling articles and the provisions and the empowerment that we give to the Conference of the Parties is extremely important, because we're not going to be able to populate an annex with, or even consider the 3,200 chemicals of concern for population of an annex. We may be able to get some of the highest risk, the ones that we can create consensus on, but we're going to also have to give ourselves the ability to continuously list over time and get at the problem progressively. And so this leads me a little bit to the scientific body and the question about the science policy interface. It's our view that we're going to need a dedicated scientific body that sits underneath the Conference of the Parties, one that is responsive to the governing body, to the Conference of the Parties, that can be tasked with looking at certain issues, whether certain chemicals should be restricted, whether certain groups of chemicals should be restricted, what potential criteria should guide the design of certain products. And we're going to have to create this body so that we can have that iterative process between science and policy, so that we can have that central body that represents the agreed upon facts upon which we can then base decisions. And so while there are scientific bodies or panels that are being contemplated that would sit outside of the convention that can play a useful role, we believe that we need to have a body that sits under the convention that's designed specifically to address plastics and the chemicals therein, and that can be responsive to our questions and we can continually call upon to provide us more information to inform our decision making. We do not want to see this body sit outside, somewhat detached, difficult to access, because we're going to have a lot of questions that are going to need answering. And with respect to the developing country question, that is a very, very tough one. In my mind, a lot of developing countries are struggling with the fact that they are recipients, as the distinguished delegate from Antigua and Barbuda has said. They're recipient countries. They receive the products, and so that speaks to the importance of having some clarity, some criteria to guide product design. It's going to be impossible to know without some sort of common understanding of the polymers and the chemicals that can go into any product. It's going to be hard to know what's in it otherwise. And so we are going to have a moment where hopefully we can make that switch, where every plastic bottle, every food contact material, every type of product that we want to set criteria for, there's going to be that moment in time where that comes into existence. The countries adopt that criteria. It becomes an obligation on the manufacturers to only produce products that meet that criteria. And from that point onward, I think we will ease the burden for countries that aren't involved in the manufacture of products. And it'll be a transition that we need to make, and it'll take time and it'll be a struggle. But I think that's one of the secrets to overcoming this issue that developing countries confront, especially those that do not produce the majority of the products that they use. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Tim. Maybe I can ask also you, Lynn Roy, to comment on this question regarding developing countries, and indeed any other question that you would like to address that have come from the floor.
Well, thank you. I think there is what is most glaring and in the chemicals industry generally is that we are using products for which we do not have sufficient information, and they are widely used, and the toxicity and other impacts are just not known. And to me, that stems more so from a failure to regulate in the countries that do produce them. So whilst we're here trying to hammer out agreements and look at capacity development in other countries, perhaps the countries where these products are in fact generated need to enhance the manner in which they do go about the responsible or the production of these chemicals and products in a responsible manner. So this lack of information that does now currently exist that poses a problem downstream is a problem that needs to be very quickly addressed. I'm not sure within the context of the plastics agreement itself, but to encourage countries to strengthen their regulatory processes in the countries that do produce. And unless you stem the tide from that end, it's a constant updating of lists. My preference would be negative lists or so, and that can be adhered to. And the issue of regrettable substitutions addressed, but there's quite a significant need for innovation and research in these producing countries to address the issues what that may occur downstream. And this innovation hopefully can be promoted within the convention and within other fora such as the Science Policy Panel, which would be one of these other instruments that would play a key role, such that we address it within the entire life cycle.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Lynn-Roy. I also wanted to pick up on that, the other aspect of Walter's question, the challenge of quantity and the proposal they made for clustering of chemicals. Maybe ask you to address that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think that the treaty represents an excellent opportunity to do this, to really address these clusters of chemicals. From a scientific perspective, it's definitely possible for several groups of chemicals that are known today. And for others, where there is no data, I think there will be it will be important to have a review process, for example, with a similar setup as under the Stockholm Convention, where there's a review committee or a scientific body specifically sitting under the Plastics Treaty. And I appreciate that the report clearly outlines the pros and cons of different approaches. And I share Lynn-Roy's concerns that developing a positive list would entail quite a lot of work, and it is likely to lead to regrettable substitution. And I would therefore argue that maybe, given the data constraints that we have today, a more suitable approach could be to combine a negative list with an approach that ensures, like what we've heard earlier today, that ensures that if there's no public safety data, it should not be allowed on the market. And the similar comments that you made on transparency before, I think that's going to be crucial to ensure that to overcome the challenges of identification that a lot of countries are facing. And I really want to highlight that today, a lot of the costs are externalized instead of the industry internalizing those costs. And I think that it's important with control measures that internalizes more of these costs for transparency towards the industry.
Thank you so much for that. We are approaching the end of our allotted time for this side event. Indeed, we are a little bit over time. We started a little bit late, so maybe we will have time for one quick, if the gentleman there in a red tie can be very brief.
Thank you. I'll keep it very brief. My question is essentially, are you able to point to any research on the bioavailability of the hazardous chemicals within the plastic once it's within plastic?
Julie? Yes.
Thank you for this question. So there are several chemicals, but let's take this example of UV328. This is a persistent organic pollutant, not yet listed, but there has been generous consensus that it should be controlled. When the POPs review committee looked at this chemical, the committee's task is to decide whether the chemical is as a result of its long-range environmental transport that leads to significant adverse human health or environmental effects such that global action is warranted. And when you talk about adverse human health human health and environmental effects as a result of longer-range environmental transport, that is really about bioavailability. I mean, you know, how that the chemical is really affecting human health or environment and in that particular remote part. And so indeed, it is possible to have such scientific data, depending on chemicals. Of course, the availability of data different. But the Stockholm Convention already has some of those experiences in looking at such criteria. So as I said, that I really encourage BRS focal points to participate in plastics negotiation, but it's vice versa for the plastic negotiators to also participate in BRS Convention discussion, so that they can also look at what is already in the Stockholm Convention criteria, how POP's review committee has been worked so far. I think it will give a lot of insight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, to wrap up this slide, First Councillor Rwanda, and we agree to do some concluding remarks. Before I give them the floor, however, I would like to thank really Karen and Nico for the presentation, and also presenting Kay and Leroy for sharing their thought and reflection. It's all very helpful. Thanks also to the audience.
Magnus, you have to use the microphone.
I was off the whole time and you didn't tell me. Okay, I will be very brief then. I would like to thank presenters, the panelists, and also the governments that have organized this event, Uruguay, Rwanda, and Norway. Thanks also to Norway for providing funding for the report that was presented here today. So I think this was a really helpful event and really useful for those of us preparing for the second round of plastic treaty negotiations in Paris later this month. And with that, I would like to give the floor now to First Councillor Tubanambasi. Edmund, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Moderator, Excellencies, Ambassadors here present, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me start by presenting the excuses from my Ambassador Marie-Chantal Rwakazina, who had wished to be here with us, but couldn't make it due to conflicting schedules. Representing her, I have the honor to deliver the following closing remarks on behalf of Government of Rwanda. The delegation of Rwanda would like to thank their excellencies, Ambassador Alvero of Uruguay and Ambassador Tine Smith of Norway, for their opening remarks. Many thanks as well to all delegations here present, BRS focal points, our great panelists, and you, Mr. Moderator, for the job well done. Today holds much significance in history as it marks the launch of the scientific report, which proves the use of harmful chemicals that the High Ambition Coalition members are calling for restriction and elimination under illegally binding legal instruments in order to save human health and environment. The problem we seek to address is real. The launch of this report takes place at the right time when we all look forward to the second session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee that is expected to come up with a zero draft with the provisions enabling the restriction and elimination of a big number of chemicals used in plastic production that remain unregulated in any legal instruments currently. We hope that all BRS and Minamata Convention member states will continue to play their significant role to ensure that a legally binding plastic treaty addresses the available gaps which are leading to unsustainable production and consumption of plastics. We call upon all state parties to work together in a synergized framework towards realizing our common goal of ending plastic pollution by 2040. This year is a crucial year for the elimination of chemicals and hazardous wastes. We hope that BRS CoP is paving the right way towards the INEC 2, which is, as mentioned, scheduled to take place in Paris during the last week of May this year. We thank all members of the High Ambition Coalition for their tremendous efforts to ensure that plastics produced are recyclable and free from all harmful chemicals. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank BRS Secretariat for the work accomplished that reminds us that we still have a long way to go to save human health and environment from chemicals in plastics. Distinguished participants, addressing harmful chemicals in plastics and their wastes requires joint efforts. In this regard, before I conclude, I would like to recall the need of collective urgent action to restrict and eliminate the use of harmful chemicals and ensure that no plastic waste will be in nature by 2040. Lastly, on behalf of members of the High Ambition Coalition to end plastic pollution, co-chaired by Norway and Rwanda, we would like to request all parties to BRS conventions to join the coalition. There is no doubt that we all share the common ambition of protecting human health and environment. In conclusion, the delegation of Rwanda looks forward to meeting you in Paris for INEC2 to continue these joint efforts together. I thank you for your kind attention.